This is the newest DualSense. It's the DualSense Chroma. Is it any better than the Gen 1 controller? And this controller is really bad for fighting games. Let's find out. Here it is side by side. You can see the visual difference here, but the basic layout is the same. You know, I'm not sure about this. I could be tripping here, but the new controller just feels smaller. Just a tiny bit smaller than the Gen 1 controller. Now the new reflective colors are cool, but as you can see here, mine's already scratched up, probably just painted on, whereas my old one is still in pretty good condition. In terms of the sticks, I feel like these sticks are a little lighter than on the Gen 1 version. And the button switches also feel different as well. These are a little bit louder and more clicky, but they are still rubber dome switches. You can definitely audibly hear this, versus on the Gen 1, you can barely hear the switches at all. Also, in terms of the tension, the switches on the new one feels a little bit heavier than on the Gen 1. Maybe that's why it's making a lot more noise. The shoulder buttons feel the same, very clicky and tactile. The triggers are the same. They have a pretty good amount of resistance. Now, in terms of the face buttons, I feel that because the controller is smaller, the face buttons is also closer together, making it a lot easier for you to press multiple buttons at once. Whereas on the Gen 1, these buttons are pretty far apart. It's kind of difficult to press the X and circle buttons at the same time here. The size of the buttons feels the same, just that on the Chroma, they feel a little closer together. You can play claw just fine here. Now let's get on to the D-pad. The Gen 1 D-pad, let me tell you, is just horrific for fighting games. Look at this wiggle. This would oftentimes cause you to do a diagonal when you don't want to. So you, for example, if you just press back like this, it's going to trigger a diagonal. But on the new one, you see there's not a lot of wiggle at all. This is a lot more stable. And I also feel that the whole D-pad is smaller than on the Gen 1. The edges on the Chroma D-pad is also more rounded off versus how it's so flat on the Gen 1. So on the new one, it's definitely a lot more comfortable to do motion input and slide your thumb around. Double taps, really responsive. Diagonals are pretty accurate. Now if you look at this move right here, you're supposed to duck and then do a 4-6 plus punch. However, I don't recommend you slide it like this. I'll show you what I mean. So I do a down punch and then back, and then all of the other directions get activated. You see that? And then you have punch. What you need to do in this instance is press them separately. So you go down, press this, lift your finger up, and then press forward. Like that. Works 100% of the time. Just gotta do it really fast. Virtua Fighter is pretty strict in terms of precise inputs, so sliding around this controller is not gonna work. But generally, motion inputs is pretty good on this controller. Now while the D-pad itself is pretty good for motion inputs, the thing about it that makes it a little tough is that if you have sweaty hands or sweaty fingers, the surface here, it gets sticky when you have moisture. I wish the material on this D-pad is not this shiny plastic, maybe something like this, a little bit more matte. That way your thumb can slide around it a little more smoothly, even with moisture. And you can see how forgiving Street Fighter is. So I'm doing a down back, and then I go up, and then here's the accidental diagonal, and it's okay, it's fine. But if you do this in other games like Virtua Fighter, it's not gonna work. So just keep that in mind. Quarter circle back, easy. Quarter circle forward, not a problem. I can do a double slide right there. Now with 360s, it's a little bit more difficult just because the surface here is sticky. So it's just not as consistent as you can see. It's time for the polling rate test. On wired, minimum input delay, I get about 4 milliseconds. Same thing with maximum input delay, and on average, 4 milliseconds. Jitter is really good, as you can see here. There's barely any jitter at all. The polling rate is about 250 Hz, and you can see the stability here is very good, almost 100%. Although I'm a little disappointed, to be honest with you, with the polling rate. This is essentially the same as the Gen 1 DualSense. Now if you look at the edge, it's over 1000 Hz. I guess Sony really wants you to buy the premium controller, right? If you want a higher performance. Do not play this controller on Bluetooth. Just don't do it. So minimum input delay, 1.19 milliseconds. That sounds pretty good, right? But then look at this gap. Maximum, 113 milliseconds. This is a huge gap, and this is because jitter is just outrageously bad on this controller. Look at this, it's over 16 milliseconds. On Bluetooth, it's going to be very inconsistent, and on average input delay is over 13 milliseconds. This is just too much. Anything over 7 or 8 milliseconds, that's too much. And look at this polling rate, 76. And the stability, as you may have guessed, is very bad. So about 40% of the time, your controller is not going to work as intended. So do me a favor, if you get this controller, just play it on wired. Alrighty, final thoughts. I would say this controller is pretty good for fighting games. However, there's a couple of things here that prevent it from being great. Of course, we just went over it. One is the polling rate. It's decent, but it's not the best. I do like the fact that the buttons are a little bit smaller, so they're a little easier to use. But the main problem I have with this controller is the surface. The material they use on this D-pad is just too sticky. But if you're not a slider like me and you just put your thumb in the middle and play like this, then this is going to be great because it's very responsive. When compared to the first gen DualSense, this is way better. This was one of the worst controllers you can get for fighting games, and now I would say it's pretty decent. Alright, that's going to be it for me. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and found it to be helpful. If you did, give it a like, subscribe for more, and take care now.